Welcome to part 2 of the podcast. In this part, we're going to dig into how to learn Zig. The other thing I really like about Zig is when I look through the website, I see a book recommended to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And the book's called Introduction to Zig. No surprises there. I love the subtitle though, a project-based book. And I notice it takes the reader through building real-world projects in Zig. So base64 encoder decoder, HTTP server, stack, and an image filter. So I like the Coding Challenges newsletter, which takes people through learning programming languages by building real-world projects, because it's the way I learned C, it's the way I learned Python, I learned Visual Basic, C#, C++, Rust, Go, through all of these. So I love that. So do you like the book? Do you recommend the book? What's your favorite project from it?
So the book is from it's a community member initiative. It's a community initiative, let's say. So it's not an official book. And to be clear, there is no official book. There will be no official book. The general stance in the Zig project is that we don't have many official things except the bare minimum. So, for example, there is no official communities except, I guess, GitHub, because that's where the main repository lives. And there's a Zulip server where the core team and other contributors collaborate and talk about developing Zig. And it's kind of strictly that, so it's not really a social space. But setting these two things aside, every community out there is basically one of many communities, and none is better or worse than the other. Like none is like officially anointed or like blessed by us. Same goes with books. So the book that you mentioned by Pedro Pak, I believe, it's a nice book. The project-based approach is, in my opinion, not a bad idea, because the reality, well, I guess, what would be the opposite of a project-based book? I guess the opposite would be a book that focuses more on like theory, right? It goes from start to A to Z, all the things about Zig that you have to learn, and then you go and you apply them to practical projects. But the problem is that Zig is a fairly simple language. Yes, you can get fancy with comp time, but setting that aside, the language doesn't have all that many keywords. It doesn't have all the many things. Like one tagline that we have on the website is focus on debugging your application, not your programming language knowledge. So it's not like C++. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a funny animated GIF or GIF, whatever people prefer, from Forrest Gump, where there's Bubba explaining to him shrimps, but in the different ways of cooking shrimps. But in that version, Bubba is explaining to Forrest all the different ways you can do initialization in C++, and it never ends. It's like static initialization. I don't even remember all of them. In any case, Zig doesn't have that. Zig doesn't have operator overload. It doesn't have distractors. It doesn't have a ton of these things. So because of that, most of the things that you need to learn to use Zig is actually learning how your computer works. It's learning what the stack is, what the relationship is between your program and the OS, why you have to ask for heap memory, what could go wrong, what could go right, how do you open a file, what other syscalls are available to you, and other memory management techniques that are not like strictly about the specifics of your OS, but are more about the general type of clever things that you can do with a computer. So like you can have linked lists, arena locators, pointer arithmetic sometimes to do cool stuff. Those are the things that you have to learn, and none of these are specific to Zig at all. So that's why I think in Zig you will find there's plenty of things that are like based on projects, because there's not a ton for you to learn about Zig. There is some. It's like, as a language, it's more structured than C, I would argue. There's more keywords than C, probably, but it's not a lot. Everything else that you need to learn is just learning how to program your computer instead of a virtual machine, which is usually what you do when you're programming in Python, for example.
That's pretty cool, because I hated programming books that take you through, like a factorial function, like a function that does this, and you never build a whole program. So
yeah,
that's why I started coding challenges, and that's why I started encouraging people to build real projects.
Yeah, Zig also has another very nice learning material that is particularly liked by people who have really zero experience with lower level programming languages, and it's called Ziglings. It's inspired by Rustlings. So the Rust version, it's basically the same thing as Rustling except for Zig, where the idea is that it's a collection of tiny programs. They're all broken. They have keyword missing, some syntax error, and there's in each of them, there's a comment that tells you what it is that you need to fix. And the idea is that they start very, very easy, and they ramp up very slowly. So if you're somebody who really doesn't like reading the language reference and also doesn't have experience with lower level programming, and you kind of want to be taken on a tour of all this stuff, then Ziglings, it's a very smooth ride. Of course, if you already know some of this stuff, you might, at some point you might find that you would want more, like you want to jump into a real project. So that's totally fair. But also for people who really don't know anything, Ziglings is a very nice starting point.
That's cool. The Rustlings were very cool. I thought that was a great thing. So Ziglings would be well worth checking out, I should imagine. Cool. So we talked about some good ways of learning Zig. Slight aside, I think it's very interesting that as VP of Community, I know you said that title's part of the email, you say there's no official community.
Yes, well, there's multiple communities. What I do is mostly show people what they can do.
So who is using Zig in production? Which companies might we see using it?
So I think there are 3 probably big names. Actually, now I think about it, there's maybe more. So number 1, we have Tiger Beetle and Bun. These are 2 startups. They decided to go all in on Zig. Bun is a JavaScript runtime bundler. It's like jack of all trades for JavaScript, and it's meant to be Node compatible. It's meant also to be faster than Node. And so the creator, Jared, has a lot of attention when it comes to performance. And so, he started developing Bun in Zig, and so far it seems so good. Tiger Beetle is very different. It's a financial database. So it's a database specialized in monetary transactions, where you have currencies, like the primitives are like currencies. You have money going in, money going out, everything has to balance out, and it's distributed. And they go really heavy on using a coding style similar to NASA, where they put explicit limits around everything. The program itself, for example, is interesting. When it loads up, it allocates memory, but then it doesn't allocate any more memory after that. So it loads all the memory it needs up front, and then it never does again. So it doesn't risk getting killed by, running out of memory, that kind of stuff. And in general, they also really enjoy the low-level approach of Zig, the fact that Zig has explicit allocators, and in general, the Zig style of development. Then there's ZML. It's another startup that is using Zig to basically allow you to write machine learning models for deployment. I'm not an expert personally, but I think the idea is that you maybe find an interesting model somewhere like Hugging Face, and maybe some of these are implemented using PyTorch, and like when you're trying stuff out, it's fine to have more like varied tool chain, but then after everything needs to go to production, you consolidate everything using ZML, and then you can deploy on different architectures, also using Zig, leveraging Zig and MLIR, if I remember correctly. Then there's Uber, although for Uber, it's kind of a peculiar thing, because they are not using Zig. They're not writing Zig code in production. What they're doing is that they're using the Zig compiler toolchain to cross-compile their C++/Go code base. So they have a huge code base. It's mainly Go, but not entirely, because it's, Go plus CGo, so all the C dependencies. And they wanted to be able to cross-compile those in the past, from Intel to ARM. And well, they weren't able to with, or rather, it was complicated with the tool chains that they had at the time. And so they started adopting Zig to be able to do that. And it was a very interesting project. Yeah, in the end, they succeeded and they opened a support contract with the Zig Software Foundation. Yeah, that's another nice example of that. I know there's another handful of companies out there who are hiring Zig developers. So they're hiring Zig developers to write Zig, but none of them are like, big names, maybe like the ones that I just mentioned.
Cool. I've seen Tiger Beetle's demos, some of the videos they put out. They're very, very cool. I like the way of visualizing it. They kind of turned simulating failure and bugs into this almost computer game-like emulation.
Yeah, the interesting thing there is that the animation, like the simulation, is actually running actual Tiger Beetle in there. Because they're able to take their source code and compile it for WebAssembly. So it's interesting because it's another form of cross compilation, but not maybe one that you usually think about, right? Or rather, the ones that we talked about right now is like Linux to Windows, whatever. But WebAssembly is also a cross compilation target, and Zig is very good at that. Not because it's designed for WebAssembly, but because WebAssembly is just another architecture that we can target like any other.
Yeah, very cool. Isn't Ghost TTY also written in Zig?
Right. Not a company, but yes, definitely a project worthy of mention. That one is from Michio Hashimoto. And yeah, it's a very good terminal emulator. I believe it made quite a splash. People are very excited by terminal emulators, and basically what Ghosty offers you. So for the people who maybe in chat who are curious, like why should you or should you not check out Ghosty? I would say Ghosty exists in the ballpark of very good terminal emulators where you already have some. So like if you're using Kitty, maybe Alacrity, maybe there's more and I'm forgetting them, and I apologize to the people who made these other terminal emulators, but I'm not like a terminal emulator nerd. Let me think. There's at least another one that I should mention that I forget. I think it's Wes. I think it's Wes term. In any case, if you already are using a pretty good terminal emulator, Ghosty is not going to be, mind-blowingly better than those. It's going to be another good terminal emulator, but what it gives you is a consistent experience across different platforms. So the idea is that it's native on macOS and it's native on Linux. And Mitchell went the extra mile to make sure that you have a good native experience. So like if you're using Kitty on macOS, for example, you can tell that it's not a purely native application. While Ghosty really integrates well with all the Windows decoration stuff, all the different ways of doing full screen and integrating with the system. Windows is not there yet, but they plan also to get on Windows. And the idea is that once they do get on Windows, they want to do the same. So have a native look and feel to the application on Windows.
Cool, very cool. Going back to the Zig website, and something that I picked up was this comment of first-class support for no standard library.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So we mentioned WebAssembly a moment ago. And if you write a program in a traditional way, like in C, for example, or the same is also partially true when it comes to Rust, but let's take the C as the example. Then your C program will probably assume that you have, the C standard library will assume that you have a file system, that you can roam around the file system, open files. It will assume that you have a heap, and then you have syscalls to allocate heap memory. Problem is, these things don't really hold true for WebAssembly. For WebAssembly, you don't really have a file system. You have pre-opens for files that you can have access to. Memory is all allocated up front. There's no way for you to, there's no syscall to get more memory that you can expect to have, just like you can on Windows, Linux, and macOS. And so what ends up happening in practice is that when you want to target WebAssembly, most of the time you have to not use the standard library. You're using, for example, a standard library data structure, like a vector, an array list, or like a hash map. And usually what happens is the hash map, you can put stuff in the hash map, but the hash map implicitly it will have inside of it a reference to a global allocator of some kind. It will try to use malloc or something like this, but you don't have malloc on WebAssembly. So how does that work? Well, the answer is that you can't use that implementation of a hash map, and you will have to get your hands on another implementation of a hash map specific to WebAssembly, where in reality it doesn't really have to be specific to WebAssembly, but what it has to do is not assume that it has access to an allocator. Well, in Zig, data structures don't assume that they have access to allocator or to a global allocator. They always ask you to provide one. And so when you target WebAssembly, the Zig standard library can be used on WebAssembly, can be used also on embedded devices, because it doesn't have the assumption that it can always have access to malloc. And so then you might ask, wait, so then how does it work? Where does it get the memory to store a new item in that case? Well, the answer is that in embedded devices and WebAssembly, what you do is that you have a chunk of memory that is available to you from the start. And what you do is that one way of doing it is that you build an allocator on top of it. In Zig, we have a few different flavors of allocators that have different behaviors. I'm not going to get too much into detail, but for example, one subtype of allocator is an allocator that instead of assuming that there's like a syscall to get more memory, that allocator instead assumes that you give it a pointer to a slice of bytes, and that's all the memory that it will have available to it, and that's what it will have to use to provide memory every time it gets asked for some. And that works. I'll give you one amazing example of this that I've worked on personally. A while ago, I started working on a static site generator. It's called Zine. It's similar to Hugo. You mentioned that you're familiar with Go, so maybe you tried Hugo. I like Hugo personally, but I wanted to make it my own, and which is inspired by Hugo to some degree. But as part of that work, I also wanted to make my own templating language. I wanted to make a templating language that was very different from what Hugo gives you. And as part of that work, I wrote a language server for HTML. So the way it works, it's called Super HTML, and you can download the CLI tool, and then you can, invoke the CLI tool, run it on files directly, or you can open your editor, set it up as your LSP, and then it gives you diagnostics whenever you write wrong HTML. For VS Code, when I first implemented it, when I first released the VS Code extension that gave you access to Super HTML, you had to install the VS Code extension, and then you had to get the language server executable in your path, which is 2 steps, and it's annoying. In the newer version of that extension, what happens now is that you get the extension, and that's all you need to have. You don't need anything else, because the extension contains a WebAssembly blob that contains the language server implementation that we run directly inside of VS Code, because VS Code is V8, it's Node. So we can run also WebAssembly on there. And so we run the language server in WebAssembly. And it's really nice. Not only it's really nice, but also the code reutilization is pretty much 100%. The only thing that I have is a main function where if I'm targeting WebAssembly, I pass as the default allocator a WASM allocator that behaves as I described earlier. So it doesn't assume a syscall, instead uses a pre-allocated slab of memory. That's it. That's all I had to change. Everything else is used one-to-one.
Cool. That's very cool. Wow. You can make me want to go and play with Zig and redo some of my coding challenges in Zig.
Yeah.
One of the coding challenges is actually to build a clone of Hugo. So anyone who wants to learn Zig, that's perhaps a good one to have a go and hit you up for any questions they've got. If anyone's interested in Zig and the community, how can they get involved? How can they help out? How can they contribute?
I would say step 1, download a copy of Zig. Step 2, start using Zig. And step 3, join a Zig community. There's, as I said earlier, there's a few different ones. So pick one that you like, maybe because you like the platform, maybe because you like the communication style. For example, we have people that like instant messaging can go on Discord. People that don't like instant messaging can go on, it's a forum style community. It's called zigit.dev. That one is forum, so it's more slow paced. And there's pretty much all in between. So join a community so you can get unblocked whenever you find something confusing and puzzling, and you can ask for help. And then start coding Zig. And like in general, I would say the best way to contribute to Zig right now is to learn it and use it to scratch your own itch. And as you learn it, you can help other people who don't know as much as you. And generally, helping out other people is like a huge help. Sometimes people come to me and say, well, I would like to contribute. How can I contribute to the compiler? And the answer is like, if you put in enough work, you can totally contribute on the compiler. It's not like impossible. It does require some ramp up because it's, a big code base, but it's totally possible. But the reality is that there is equally impactful work that you can do just by scratching your own itch and being social with other people, helping people learn more, not get stuck, not have misconceptions, and then solving your own problem. Like I wrote my static site generator because I was scratching my own itch, because I was like opinionated about static site generators. And I feel like I did a pretty good job. If I had set out to write some arbitrary library because, because somebody told me that I was missing, or because I felt like this had to exist, I feel like I would not have done an equally good job.
Cool, makes sense. Finally, then, anything we didn't talk about that you would like to share with the listeners?
Yes. So I would say, as like a final recap, and maybe one last suggestion on, let's say, community-related stuff, is that the idea of using Zig is that by approaching software development from the bottom up, from a perspective where you do put an emphasis on simplicity, which sometimes means writing more. So Zig is not there's worse languages out there when it comes to the amount of typing that you have to do. But the typing that you do in Zig is not exactly strictly boilerplate. It tends to be just a form of explicitness. And that explicitness makes projects a lot more approachable also for other people to learn from and maintain over time. And also it helps everybody understand the assumptions behind certain decisions, and when they're right, when they're wrong, when they need to change, etc. So approaching software that way is very different from how people approach software nowadays. Usually nowadays, you download a bunch of dependencies, you have a language that has a complicated runtime, and then you don't really have precise control over your application, and you kind of get what you get. And sometimes that's perfectly fine. Sometimes it becomes annoying, but it's a barrier that you can't get past. Like you're trapped. You're trapped in your runtime, and you're trapped in your dependencies. In Zig, we tend to get past that because the language doesn't have a runtime, and because we tend to implement our dependencies ourselves. Not all the time. We do depend on other people's code, but sometimes writing. I mentioned that I wrote a HTML parser by myself earlier. There's HTML parsers out there, but they all solve a slightly different use case. And sometimes the solution to your use case, even though there is a library out there that kind of solves the same problem in the general sense, it's not going to be the best library for your specific use case. So we look at development in a different way. And if you want to hang out with people that have this different perspective towards software development, like Johnny, if you watch the interview with Johnny, you can see that Johnny looks at software in a very peculiar way. And there's a lot of value in that perspective. My recommendation is twofold. After joining Zig Community in general, what I would suggest is to try and see if you can meet in person with some of those people. And there's two types of events that I would suggest. One is called Zig Days. They're like full day meetups that usually happen on a Saturday. We launched a website for this. It's literally zig.day. And there's one in Vancouver, there's one in San Francisco, there's one in Portland, there's one in Milan, where I live, northern Italy. There will be more in the future. And when you go there, it's basically full day events where you join in the morning, you sit down with your laptop with other people, and you collaborate on stuff. You can chat, you can collaborate. And the idea is that those events you will find at those events people who share this new perspective when it comes to developing software. The last recommendation is to check out Software You Can Love. It's Software You Can Love. It's a conference. Usually it's run in Milan, but we also run it in Vancouver. And it's the same idea, except that, it's a proper conference, so we have talks. The first day is actually like a Zig day. So the first day of the conference, usually we do have tables and we do hang out and we do collaborate on stuff. But then the remaining 2 days, we have talks about software. So if you never looked at software that way, do try it out. It's I personally found it very liberating.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you for that. I think you have some of those conferences on YouTube as well. Is that right?
Yes. I have a YouTube channel. It's Zig Showtime, and you can find recordings of those events. There's also one talk from Johnny Marler, which was very well received by the internet, called How to Kill Your API with Abstraction. And he talks about his experience going down the stack and learning how to write GUIs and how X11 works on Linux, and how the library that everybody uses to interface with X11 makes a ton of choices that by modern standards are not great, that actually make your experience worse, where basically you would have a better experience. It would be easier to not use that at all and just write everything on your own from scratch, just targeting the X11 protocol. It's very cool.
Yeah, I watched that talk before John and I spoke. It's well worth watching. We'll link that in the notes as well. Cool. We'll put all those links in the description. Loris, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
No problem. Thank you very much, John.